Welcome to BBC World News. I'm NAGA Munchetty.
And I'm Sally Bundock. Here are the headlines.
The UN condemns the force feeding of inmates on hunger strike at Guantanamo Bay. The public reacts to the first television interview by Amanda Knox, the woman acquitted of murdering her British roommate in Italy. The fight for Syria. The US considers its options as it investigates claims that chemical weapons were used against civilians.
Here's the president.
It's the first big-ticket item in Greece's privatisation programme, the profitable gambling firm OPAP. But without a last-minute deal, the sale could collapse. Also, later in World Business Report, we'll get a status update from Facebook. How much money has it been making since the start of the year?
First, though, let's focus on the pressure being put on President Obama to act as 100 detainees go on hunger strike in Guantanamo Bay prison. He's now promised to work harder to close the prison in Cuba. He blames Congress for blocking efforts to close the detention centre. It's been more than 4 years since his first election pledge to do so. When asked about the detainees now refusing food in protest at being held indefinitely without trial, the president said that he didn't want any to die and called on Congress to help him find a long-term legal solution. There are currently 166 people held at Guantanamo Bay, and it's thought that more than 100 are now on hunger strike. 21 are being force-fed by medical staff. Now, this practice is condemned by a UN spokesman on human rights. Our correspondent Jonathan Beale has more.
It's where the US military act as jailer, judge and jury to men captured in President Bush's war on terror. Some have been left in legal limbo here for more than 10 years, out of reach and mostly out of sight. One of his first acts when he became president was to sign an order to shut Guantanamo down within a year. 5 years on, and it still hasn't happened. But today he insisted he hadn't given up.
I'm going to go back at this. I've asked my team to review everything that's currently being done in Guantanamo, everything that we can do administratively, and I'm going to re-engage with Congress to try to make the case that this is not something that's in the best interest of the American people.
And this is why he's had to renew old vows, a growing protest with most prisoners now refusing food.
These are the more compliant.
That's correct.
In the past, when I visited Guantanamo, medical staff were already well versed in explaining how they dealt with those on hunger strike.
This catheter is passed through the nostril, into the throat and into the stomach.
We saw the chair in which prisoners are restrained and force-fed. But this latest protest is on a much larger scale. Some say it's a sign of growing despair.
6 people have committed suicide in that camp and only 3 people have been convicted, and that's not very good odds for a place that's meant to bring justice to America. There will be deaths, there's no question about it.
President Obama says he doesn't want anyone to die, and an extra 40 medical staff have now been sent to deal with the protest. But he may find it harder to persuade a skeptical public to close down Guantanamo when the alternative's holding prisoners closer to home.
I think for a majority of the American public is out of sight and out of mind, and they kind of bought into the narrative, do whatever you've got to do to keep us safe from them. And as long as they view this as an us and them proposition, the public doesn't seem to care a lot.
Congress blocked his efforts to transfer some prisoners for trial in the US. The president says he'll start those talks afresh. But so far his words have not been matched by deeds. And for now, closing Guantanamo remains a promise unfulfilled. Jonathan Beale, BBC News.
Nice questions. Let's move now to the crisis in Syria. President Obama says he won't be rushed to respond to the country's apparent use of chemical weapons. Still, allies of the Syrian government, such as the militant group Hezbollah, say that they won't let the country fall to America. Julie Peacock reports.
This disturbing footage from a hospital in Syria shows what opposition forces say is proof of the use of chemical weapons. But no one outside of Syria knows for sure. The US President Barack Obama is taking a cautious approach.
What we now have is evidence that chemical weapons have been used inside of Syria, but we don't know how they were used, when they were used, who used them. When I am making decisions about America's national security and the potential for taking additional action in response to chemical weapon use, I've got to make sure I've got the facts.
But the Syrian government denies using chemical weapons and blames opposition forces. The fighting in Syria is as fierce as ever, with neither side appearing to gain the upper hand. But now pro-government fighters near the country's borders are turning for increasing support to their allies in neighbouring territories. Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia movement, has confirmed its support for the Assad regime.
There are true friends of Syria around the world. They won't allow Syria to fall into the hands of America, Israel, and Sunni extremists. Whoever needs help, we will not hesitate to give it.
Government forces are fighting hard to push back the opposition. This footage, which we can't verify, apparently shows rebel forces taking over a military airbase. And a bomb in the capital Damascus on Tuesday killed at least 14 people. But so far, the international community is wary about becoming more deeply embroiled in this conflict. Julie Peacock, BBC News.
Just a couple of hours ago, an interview with the American student who spent 4 years in an Italian jail for the murder of her British flatmate was aired on US television. Amanda Knox said that she wanted the truth to come out and asked to be reconsidered as a person. Well, Ms Knox was acquitted 2 years ago, but does face a retrial in Italy. We can hear some of what Amanda Knox said in her interview with ABC's Diane Sawyer. She was first questioned about what she and Raphael Solicito did on the night of Meredith Kirchner's murder.
We had sex. We were together. We just hung out together. We talked. He talked to me about his mom. We made faces at each other. We were being silly and together.
How high were you?
I had smoked a joint with Raphael, and what that did to my memories was it made them less concrete, but it didn't black them out and it didn't change them.
You remember with clarity that you did not go out that night. You stayed in the whole night.
We stayed in the whole night.
The next...
OK, so that's the interview. Let's talk about how the public has reacted to this. We can speak now to our Washington correspondent, Jane Little. So, Jane, obviously, you know, I said in the introduction there she wanted to be reconsidered as a person. Will she be after this interview, do you think?
Well, I think it was a very good attempt to get her side of the story across, to set the record straight. She was at times very forceful in answering direct questions. Did you kill Meredith Kirchner? No. She was tearful, particularly when she talked about the effect all of this had had on her family. She was very defensive, particularly when asked about her inappropriate behaviour. At the top of the programme, we were reminded of how she'd often been portrayed as, quote, a sex-crazed killer, and this was her attempt to alter that image and to address some of the so-called inappropriate behaviour. She was asked, well, what about the cartwheels and the gymnastics you were reported to have done in the police station in the hours immediately after the discovery of Meredith's body? And she said, well, I did the splits to loosen up, but I wasn't doing gymnastics and cartwheels. And so she was addressing some of these issues. She was also basically very critical of the Italian justice system and saying, I didn't confess, I was interrogated, they threatened me, suggesting I wouldn't see my family again. So it was a very long, and it has to be said, quite a sympathetic interview with a strong suggestion that the Italian justice system was at fault.
That perhaps not so surprising, but I wonder, or give us your impression of how the public is reacting to this.
Well, I've just been looking at a few tweets on it, and just to give you a flavour, here's one. I don't think she's guilty, but her awkwardness isn't helping her. There are a number like that, but I think most of them are reserved for the Italian justice system. There's a lot of venom out there for it. The way the Italian police treated her is disgusting. Amanda Knox would never have been convicted in the US. There's just not enough evidence.
OK, Jane, I think the tweets and reaction going to be coming through much more over the next few hours. We'll get an even more clear idea of how people view her. Thanks very much for the moment. Jane Little there in Washington. Greeks are preparing for protest. There's another financial struggle going on in the country. Sally is following all this. Plus, Sally, there's another deadline looming.
There is indeed. In terms of protests, it's of course the 1st of May today. So it's the May Day Labour protests which will be happening in Greece. They may well be happening in other parts of Europe as well. It's an opportunity for them to show their angst as unemployment continues to rise. But the story that we're focusing on as far as Greece is concerned today in World Business Report is about their privatisation programme, because it is key to this economy getting on a firm financial footing again. And the privatisation agency that's working on behalf of the government is busy trying to get privatisations underway, and at the moment is trying to sell the very profitable gambling firm OPAP. And it's given one of the bidders, the Greek Czech fund Emma Delta, just a few more hours to try and improve its bid for a stake in this gambling company. Now, OPAP runs the country's lottery and was Greece's most profitable company last year. And its sale does mark the first big ticket item in the government's privatisation programme. So it's symbolically important. It's very important for the government that this goes well. But Emma Delta, the company that's interested in buying a bit, turned out to be the only bidder, and it didn't offer very much money as the government was hoping for. If Greece can't seal this deal today, it risks missing its asset sale target of 2.6 billion euros this year, which would leave it with the choice of imposing further austerity measures on the Greek people or asking creditors to find more money to make up for the shortfall. So that deadline is this morning in Greece. We'll talk about it in more detail in World Business Report. Also, we are looking ahead to Facebook. As I'm sure you are well aware, it is the world's #1 social media company in terms of numbers of users. It reports its first quarter results after the bell today, and its shares have picked up from the lows it hit shortly after its listing on the markets nearly a year ago. But analysts are still watching to see how well it's doing in terms of mobile users and whether it's making money out of people who are using Facebook while they're on the move. So they're using their tablets or their smartphones. So that's the big issue for Facebook. Is it working? Are they making much needed profits from those users? We will assess that and all the other business stories as well. And also in the paper review, we're looking at Apple's enormous bond sale. It was historic. We'll be discussing that. So I'll see you later.
Plenty for us to talk about later. See you later, Sally. There has been a fresh outbreak of sectarian violence in Burma. Mosques and Muslim shops have been attacked by Buddhist mobs in a town near Rangoon. It's the latest in a series of attacks on Muslim communities since 40 people were killed in clashes in central Burma last month.
Muslim families stand in the shadows, watching their homes and belongings burn to the ground. Tensions have been running high between Muslims and Buddhists in Burma for more than a month. On Tuesday, they boiled over. Buddhist mobs ran riot. 2 mosques were attacked in Okan, just over 100 kilometres north of Yangon. On the outskirts of the town, entire villages were burned to the ground. Most of the Muslim families who lived there fled for their lives. This Muslim shopkeeper's home was very badly damaged by the mob, and he's in shock. "We don't have any trouble with the Buddhists," his wife says. "My husband is Muslim and follows Islam, and I believe in Buddhism. Even if my son wants to be a Buddhist monk, he's allowed to do that." This is not the first time violence has flared between Muslims and Buddhists in Burma. In March, Buddhist mobs rampaged through another town, killing at least 43 people. This time the violence was sparked by the most trivial of incidents. A young Muslim girl on a bike bumped into a Buddhist monk. That, though, was provocation enough. Large numbers of police have been deployed to Okan to keep the situation under control. But stopping this violence from spreading to other towns will be a major challenge for the Burmese authorities. And human rights groups say they're deeply concerned about the future. Wendy Urquhart, BBC News.
Do stay with us on BBC News. There's plenty to come, including a Spanish doctor who's convicted for his involvement in professional cycling's doping scandal. Let's take a look at some news in the UK now. The President of the United Arab Emirates, Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed, was greeted by the Queen on the first day of his state visit to Britain. He's scheduled to meet the Prime Minister later. David Cameron's expected to raise the case of the 3 British men jailed in Dubai for drug possession. They said they were subjected to torture. A high-profile unit of civil servants is to be turned into a partly private, profit-making venture by the government. It will be the first policy-making body to be turned into a mutual, an organisation partly owned and run by its staff. Sources say that dozens of other units could follow. MPs say that Britain's international reputation would be damaged if Scotland voted for independence. The Common Foreign Affairs Committee says that the loss of Scotland could fuel perceptions that the UK was in decline. The SNP has dismissed the report as unbalanced, saying it was written by politicians who are opposed to Scotland's independence. You're watching BBC World News. I'm NAGA Munchetty. Here are the headlines. President Obama says that the military detention center at Guantanamo Bay is not necessary to keep America safe and should be closed. In an interview on US television, Amanda Knox, the American student cleared of murdering her British roommate in Italy, says that she wants the truth to come out. Northern Nigeria may be plagued by insecurity at the moment, but it's not the only part of the country where the threat of violence is worrying. It has been almost 4 years since an amnesty was given to thousands of militants who were causing havoc in the Niger Delta. The relative peace has allowed oil production in the region to soar, but the recent killing of 12 policemen has come as a warning that the peace may not be on solid ground. Our Nigeria correspondent Will Ross reports from Yenagoa in Bayelsa State.
The Nigerian military patrolling the creeks of the Niger Delta and sending out the message, we're ready for action. The soldiers here have good reason to be on high alert after an armed gang recently ambushed a police boat, killing 12 officers.
Attacking law enforcement agents is like attacking the state. And I foresee a situation whereby those people may want to, in order to gain recognition, want to attack innocent civilians.
All appears calm in this Delta Creek. As a result of an amnesty, around 30,000 people are paid a monthly allowance to embrace peace. But a man from the same village as the gang that killed the policeman says he knows many ex-militants who have resorted to crime, including piracy.
Those of them that we are doing sea piracy presently in my own place, they all have already embraced amnesty. They have received the amnesty money, but later they went and bought gun.
When the militants were causing havoc in these creeks all over the Niger Delta, oil production dropped significantly. But since the amnesty, it's soared, and now the government's getting far more revenue from the oil, so it can easily afford to pay all the ex-militants. But some people are questioning the wisdom of paying people who took up arms, and they're wondering what kind of a message it sends out to the rest of the country. Some of the men who laid down their arms are now living big. Driving through Yenagoa, you can't miss this home. It belongs to a former militant leader who has grown rich fast. This one is not as gaudy, but it's still relatively luxurious. It belongs to an ex-militant general who says he brought more than 400 fighters out of the creeks with him under the amnesty.
It's one of my commanders in the creek when I was there.
Was he the strongest out of this group?
He was one of the strongest.
Reuben Wilson was paid by the government to protect the pipelines his fighters once sabotaged, and now he's struck a deal to provide security for an oil company.
They will also give me a major contract to do maybe supplying of chemicals, maybe supplying of equipment, you know. So by 2-3 years, you know, when you come back, maybe you will see me in a big mansion like the ones you have been seeing.
The Nigerian government is for now buying the peace, but the underlying grievances remain: the deep poverty, lack of development and pollution. Until they're dealt with, it will be hard to stop people believing that crime pays. Will Ross, BBC News, Yenagoa in the Niger Delta.
But I imagine A doctor who's alleged to have run one of the sport's biggest ever doping rings has been given a jail sentence by a Spanish court. Dr. Eufemiano Fuentes was found guilty of breaking public health laws for trying to boost the performances of cyclists. However, as Tom Burridge reports, anti-doping agencies fear that his practices also affected other sports.
Jesus Manzano arriving at court today in Madrid. He's a former Spanish cyclist and whistleblower on what could be one of sport's biggest ever doping rings. The man who Manzano says ran the doping ring is Dr. Fuentes, seen here entering court last month. In 2006, police raided his offices in Madrid. They seized 200 bags of frozen blood and plasma. The bags had code names, allegedly relating to the athletes that were part of Dr. Fuentes' doping program. He wasn't in court today, as a judge found him guilty of breaking public health laws. He was given a 1-year suspended sentence and struck off as a sports doctor for 4 years. The reason that Dr. Fuentes only faced charges that he endangered the health of the athletes involved and not doping offences was because doping was not illegal here in Spain when the police raids took place. The trial here has only considered evidence linking Dr. Fuentes to cycling. However, the Spanish and world anti-doping agencies believe athletes from other sports were involved too. Jesus Manzano, the former Spanish cyclist and whistleblower in this case, claims he saw footballers, boxers and athletes going in to be treated by Dr. Fuentes. Today he told me the verdict in this case made him laugh. Spain's anti-doping agency agreed the judge's ruling was less than perfect. Its boss said she would appeal against the judge's decision to destroy all the evidence linked to the case.
It's very, very important to do an appeal in the next 10 days, because for the Spanish anti-doping agency, it's very important to know all the truth. And with this sentence, we know only a part of the truth.
What happens to the bags of blood, now held in a laboratory in Barcelona, will be key. If the true extent of Dr. Fuentes' alleged doping program and possibly the names of athletes linked to other sports is to come out. Tom Burridge, BBC News in Madrid.
On Tuesday, we reported that the American basketball star Jason Collins had used a magazine to tell the world that he was gay. He's the first active player in the 4 main American sports to come out. Well, the announcement provoked a huge reaction across the world and much discussion about why it took him so long. Well, since then, he's spoken to ABC News about his decision.
I tried everything in the book as far as trying to convince myself, to lead, the life that you should.
You were engaged to a woman at one point.
Yes, and calling off the wedding was obviously a tough decision, but it was the right one because I knew I wasn't getting married for the right reasons.
What are you expecting from your teammates, your competitors, when you step back on the court?
From my teammates, I'm expecting support because that's what I would do for my teammates. A team is like a family. The NBA is like a brotherhood. And I'm looking at it that we're all, support each other on and off the court.
You hoping other players follow your example now?
I hope that every player makes a decision that leads to their own happiness, whatever happiness that is in life. I know that I, right now, am the happiest that I've ever been in my life.
Let's stay with sport, and in football, Borussia Dortmund is the first team through to the final despite a 2-0 loss against Real Madrid in the semi-final second leg in Spain on Tuesday. Well, the Germans went to the match, remember, with a 4-1 aggregate lead. Real Madrid did fight back during the closing stages, scoring first through Karim Benzema in the 83rd minute and then through Sergio Ramos 5 minutes later, but Real failed to get that third goal that it needed. Afterwards, it was the future of Real manager Jose Mourinho which dominated discussion. The special one, as he's known, is talking about a move back to England.
My future doesn't depend on that. I told that before. And it's a pity that people read the newspaper, but after that they don't read when Klopp says, I never told him I was going to Chelsea.
Wales's Sam Warburton will captain the British and Irish Lions rugby squad for the upcoming tour of Australia. Coach Warren Gatland confirmed the appointment of the forward while naming a squad of 37 for the tour. The 24-year-old will be one of 15 Welsh players included, with 10 from England, 9 from Ireland and 3 Scottish.
We left it open-ended in terms of, you know, if we did pick up an injury to one of our 10s on tour, you know, could he potentially come in and fill a hole for us later in the tour? And he said, well, that's a discussion that maybe we could have later on. And but he didn't rule himself out, but he didn't commit himself to come in.
Now, you've heard the songs, you've seen the dance. Now you can read the book about Gangnam Style. Well, it's a comic book anyway. The South Korean rapper Psy is now immortalised in his very own graphic novel. Now, what this does is chart the rise to fame from childhood to international stardom. Also, in case you were worried, it does include, as you can see, a guide on how to do those famous dance moves. As I've always said, you just imagine you are riding a horse, put it to music, and it will all work. I wonder how popular that's going to be. Don't forget, you can get in touch with me on Twitter. My address is @BBC NAGA. Are you keen to get an instruction manual on Gangnam Style? Would you be doing it? Sally's up next with World Business Report. Now here's the weather where you are. Hello, this is BBC World News. I'm NAGA Munchetty. Here are the headlines. The United Nations Human Rights Commission has said that the force feeding of prisoners at the American detention camp at Guantanamo Bay contravenes international law. President Obama says he doesn't want any prisoner to die and has pledged to renew efforts to close the camp down. President Obama has said that he won't be rushed to respond to Syria's apparent use of chemical weapons. He said he didn't rule out action if it's proved that President Assad had used chemical weapons, but said the details has yet to be established. Amanda Knox, the American student who was cleared of murdering British student Meredith Kercher, has told ABC's Diane Sawyer that she's innocent. It's the first time that she's spoken about the case and her time in jail. And there has been a new outbreak of violence in Burma as sectarian tensions run high in the country. It's reported that mosques and Muslim shops have been attacked by Buddhist mobs in a town near Rangoon. Those are the latest headlines from BBC World News. Hello. Enid Blyton's books have been in print ever since she wrote her first one in 1922, and generation after generation of children have fallen in love with the famous 5, the Secret 7, and of course Noddy. But there has never been an exhibition dedicated to her work until now. Our entertainment correspondent Colin Patterson takes a look.
This is the mystery of Enid Blyton and the very long wait. Author of the famous 5 and the Secret 7, the number here is 45. That's how many years it's taken from Enid Blyton's death for there to be an exhibition dedicated to her work.
When she was alive and very active, she'd toured and held events and talked to children about how she wrote. But from the 60s through the 70s and 80s, she was less fashionable. And I think with that distance of time, we can appreciate Enid and all she brought to our literary heritage for children.
For their mother, Mrs. Darrell Waters, is Enid Blyton. Every day when she's working on a book, she rattles out about 6,000 words.
The exhibition includes her actual typewriter, the only unpublished Enid Blyton full-length novel, and areas dedicated to her most famous stories.
Climbing up the top branch of the faraway tree, and there you are, in some peculiar land. Oh, Noddy, look, do as I do, said Big Ears.
But despite selling upwards of 500 million books, Enid Blyton has been heavily criticised over the years.
She's been called everything from a racist to a sexist to a classist, and some of those things, when you're looking at them from the perspective of 2013, might seem true. But you have to remember that she was very much a woman of her time. She was reflecting the values of her day. It seemed normal to most people.
The exhibition doesn't shy away from these issues, but its main aim is simply to celebrate the work of Enid Blyton and explain why her appeal has spanned generations.
Hello, welcome back to BBC News. I'm Naga Munchetti. Here are the top stories. President Obama says that the military detention centre at Guantanamo Bay is not necessary to keep America safe and should be closed. Amanda Knox, the American student acquitted of murdering Meredith Kercher, her British roommate in Italy, has given her side of the story in her first television interview.
What happened to me hit me like a train. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. I was really afraid.
The fight for Syria, the US considers its options as it investigates claims that chemical weapons were used against civilians.
Here's the president.
And there has been a new outbreak of violence in Burma as sectarian tensions between Muslims and Buddhists run high in the country. OK, it's time for us to take a look at the newspapers and see which stories are making headlines around the world. Let's begin with The Independent. It claims that dozens of British state-owned services will be spun off into independent companies in one of the biggest privatisation programmes since the 1980s.
It gets rather less coverage in the British papers, but Gulf News is all over this story. It's on its front page, putting the President of the United Arab Emirates' visit to the UK in a lot of detail. Interestingly, it makes no mention of the British men recently convicted of drugs offences in Dubai amid allegations of torture.
The Financial Times reports that the US Federal Reserve officials are considering a stricter cap on bank leverage in an attempt to limit the riskiness of big lenders.
But if there's concern over the state of the world's finances, no one's told the FTSE 100. The UK's blue chip stock index has staged an 11th-month rally, its longest ever winning streak. So says the business section of today's Daily Telegraph.
Apple has launched the biggest corporate bond sale ever. This was yesterday as investors queued up to lend it $17 billion. This will allow the company to return money to shareholders without incurring a big tax bill, so writes The Guardian.
And if we stay with The Guardian, a British climber and two companions confronted on Mount Everest by an angry mob are returning home, says the paper. It talks about the fact that the help from other climbers meant that they were not seriously injured or perhaps even killed by a group of up to 100 Sherpas. Scary, scary stuff.
Fight on up high. Joining us for the newspaper review is independent financial analyst Louise Keeper. Lovely to have you with us, Louise.
Good morning, Louise.
Good morning. Let's start with The Independent. And what's expected, what it says today is that Francis Maude, who's the Cabinet Office Minister, is going to announce that the government's behavioural insights team, it's known as the Nudge Unit, which to me doesn't make any clearer what it really does, but it's going to be mutualised. Explain, firstly, a mutual, and also why this actually could be the start of a trend across Europe, in fact.
OK, so this is a public sector organisation, so paid for and owned by the taxpayer. And it looks like, again, this is just in one newspaper, we don't know, we have to wait to see the announcement, is going to sort of be moved to the private sector. And it could even be sold off, which could raise revenue. And in fact, that I think, is the reason why The Independent is going with this story. Because basically, although this is only one tiny unit, what The Independent is saying is this will be the start of far more sell-offs and privatisations. So this sale today is pretty small and irrelevant, but actually it begins a trend for the government privatising and selling off government businesses.
Because it's looking at things like the Land Registry, the Office for National Statistics could also become candidates for mutualisation. And for anyone who doesn't know, Mutual is a body that's also owned by the people who work for it.
Exactly. And what is interesting is clearly the big privatisations, the big sell-offs that were in Thatcher years in the 1980s, and it was a big help to sort of make the government finances better because they got a load of money in. And do you remember British Telecom, British Gas, British Petroleum, BP, a whole load of other utility companies? And so this is quite interesting that we might, is this the start of potentially a second wave of reducing the role of the government, the state, in various parts of the business? We wait and see.
Very interesting indeed. Let's now move on to Gulf News front page, which is all over the visit of the President of the United Arab Emirates to the UK. It's a two-day visit, and he spent a lot of yesterday in Windsor with the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. Now, this is the first visit for 24 years of a President of the UAE, and of course this paper is very gushing about it. It's hardly mentioned in the British press.
It was in the news last night. There was pictures of Sheikh Khalifa with the Queen visiting Windsor Castle. Apparently, they had a trip around Windsor in an open top.
And it was a sunny day. It was a sunny day, a rare moment.
That's probably what they did. It's the UAE, but sunny enough. Sunny for us.
But you are right. You know, there has been some coverage in the UK. Clearly, the defence industry will probably be getting quite excited about this, and there are selected industries that will want to use this trip as an opportunity to boost British exports, and clearly there is a business part to this trip as well.
Worth mentioning, though, as Sally said, a gushing or a favourable report. What wasn't mentioned is the fact that 3 British men have been jailed in Dubai, and they have claimed that they were tortured. This is over drugs offences. David Cameron is also going to meet His Highness Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed later as well, and that will be brought up.
And that has been in the British newspapers quite a lot.
Now, Financial Times, front page. 2 stories, actually. We've highlighted already Fed weighs tighter cap on bank leverage. So the Fed perhaps looking at how banking is operating and ways of making it better. And at the same time, we've got Osborne next to it, makes growth plea to Bank of England, sort of saying to the Bank of England, please not be overzealous in focusing on banking stability, because actually it's curtailing our growth here. Interesting, isn't it?
So what you have 2 things is you have 2 competing desires from politicians. On the one hand, politicians want banks to be safer so that they don't have to be bailed out by taxpayers' money in the future. So that's the first one, and that's what reducing bank leverage was all about. So leverage is the amount that a bank takes in deposits, and then the amount it gives out in loans. And the larger the amount of loans they make on the back of a smaller amount of deposits means the bank is more dangerous. So that's what leverage is. So that's one side. They want to restrict the leverage that banks use to make the bank safer. On the other hand, politicians are desperate for the banks to lend, because credit crunches are very dangerous to an economy. Credit is the lifeblood of an economy. But if you want banks to decrease their leverage, they will lend less. That's how it works. And so here we've got 2 different policies, you've got 2 different things. We've got the Fed saying, we want our banks to be safer, reduce the leverage, and you've got Osborne saying, yeah, it's important the banks are safe, but actually we need the economy to grow.
It's funny, though, isn't it, that, you know, George Osborne is making his plea to the Bank of England, when many might just say, hang on a second, George Osborne, isn't it your job to make sure that our economy is growing? I know it's not specifically just on his shoulders,
he should have a hand in it,
but
though,
some people,
he?
you know, might point the finger at him and say, hang on a minute, shouldn't you be doing more?
Well, what's interesting is the Fed had, or in America, they had TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Programme, which forced banks and financial companies to take money from the government. That happened in 2008, barely 12 months after the start of the crisis. In the UK, we may have bailed out Royal Bank of Scotland and Lloyds, but the rest of the banks still don't have much capital.
Are you excited about the fact that the FTSE is recording an 11-month rally?
Yeah, this is the first time in many, many years. This is in the Daily Telegraph's business section. And apparently it's the first time we've had an 11-month winning streak since its inception in 1984. I think what this tells us, with governments all around the world ripping interest rates down to virtually nothing, huge amounts of money printing, is that investors don't have a lot of choices as to where to put their money. And therefore, equities are relatively one place where you will get a little bit of dividend yield.
And also as well, people wrongly assume the FTSE 100 reflects the UK economy, and actually it doesn't at all, does it? Because many companies listed on the FTSE 100 are not British companies.
Yes, and it's not just that, but actually they tend to be very multinational companies. So
a lot of miners.
Exactly, and there has
kind of companies.
There has been guess estimates that about 70% of the earnings, the profits from FTSE 100 do come from overseas.
You know what I find interesting? When a company like Apple, which we talk about a lot, we look at technology companies in great detail, launches a bond sale to avoid tax? Or is that, am I being a little bit too simplistic and cynical?
Well, I think you have a right to say that. Mm-hmm. Yes, I think you probably do. So, Apple, phenomenally successful. So successful, it's got almost $150 billion on its balance sheet. It is awash with cash. Therefore, you think to yourself, why would the world's richest company decide to launch the biggest bond issue in the world? Because it doesn't need the money. Well, the answer to that is, although it might have all this cash on its balance sheet, most of it is overseas, about $100 billion overseas, and therefore it makes sense to, from a tax-efficient perspective, to keep the money overseas, not to bring it back to the US, because that will trigger a lot of taxation payments, and that's how they're doing it.
Also, as well, it kind of keeps shareholders on board, because they've had to stomach a big fall in their share price from $700 to around $400, and they've all been moaning, you've got all this money, we haven't seen any new innovation, what's going on, our share price is going down, so it's kind of keeping them on side, perhaps?
Exactly. Last week, with the results, Apple did announce an enormous share buyback and an enormous dividend, and this is one of the ways it's funding it. To be honest, though, this trend of large bond offerings, all companies are doing it because interest rates are so low.
You know, it was quite interesting. We've been following this story about these climbers who have been praised for saving the lives of a trio in an Everest attack. Basically, there was a couple of climbers that went to the top of Everest. They upset the Sherpas who traditionally guide climbers up there, and when they came back down, there could have been a big almighty row.
You would have thought, on the world's highest mountain with oxygen deprivation, you wouldn't have had the energy for fisticuffs. But no, we are wrong. They clearly had the energy to beat each other up, and it's not quite as simplistic as you suggested as the three European climbers are making out. The other side of the story is that from the Sherpa's perspective, the British, Swiss and Italian climber did something dangerous that endangered their lives. And it seems there's a bit of a cultural clash between the two sides.
Very interesting.
We wait to see exactly what happened.
The truth will out.
Well,
Louise,
even from that high.
Always a pleasure having you with us. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.